Suspicion in the White House. Who was pulling the strings in the arms deal with Iran?
I was not fully informed on the nature of one of the activities undertaken in connection with this initiative.
My role in that was zero.
I didn't know that anything was happening.
The other members of the NSC, none of us knew.
Does responsibility rest finally in the Oval Office? Political analyst Dr. Fred Knelman, author of Reagan, God, and the Bomb, thinks so, and he's coming up. But first, scientists are turning to the sea in search of new drugs in the fight against cancer. But will their research stay in Canada or end up in American labs? The new Drug Patent Act is designed to keep research money at home, or will it push the price of prescription drugs sky high? Gene Swanson, activist for the poor, thinks the bill is a sellout to the multinationals. And Russ Hunter, acting for seniors groups, agrees. But their opponents think it's time the people who invented the drugs should have their ideas protected. Coming up first, Terry Mailloux, president of Pacific Pharmaceutical, and UBC scientist Dr. Robert Rangno. Sitting in for Jack Webster, Iona Campagnolo.
Welcome to Webster. I'm Iona Campagnolo, sitting in for Jack until the Christmas season's over. Tonight we have 4 informed guests to explore changes in the Prescription Drug Act. And before Christmas, Bill C20 could be law. Will it mean increased drug prices for you and for your family and for Canada's sick and old? Or will it mean increased innovation and creative development of new drugs for much-needed areas of concern in the healthcare business? First, we have Ted Rutledge, however. He's gone out and found Raymond Anderson, a scientist who is developing drugs right here in BC right now without benefit of the new legislation.
Scientists say a cure for cancer is still many years away, but that hasn't stopped their research. Right now, they're focusing their attention on the ocean to find new compounds to help battle the disease. This is one of many chemistry labs at UBC, where research is underway to tap the oceans as a possible link in finding a cure for cancer. Although still in the initial stages of testing, researchers here say a single extract from a common West Coast starfish holds some promise in combating the disease.
It turns out that this particular compound has some very promising anti-cancer activity.
Professor Raymond Anderson of UBC's Oceanography and Chemistry departments isolated the compound imbricatin from starfish after it was noticed that a certain type of anemone reacts unusually to the chemical. The normally sedentary creatures suddenly begin swimming.
What we discovered was that there's only a single compound in the thousands of compounds that are present in the starfish that's capable of causing the swimming response. And the thing that got us excited about this compound was that the observation that a single compound could elicit a very special sort of biological response. And when we find that, we call this type of compound a biologically active compound. When you find a compound that's that specific and that active, you then submit it to a whole range of other biological assays to see if it could have some pharmaceutical utility. It turns out that this particular compound has some very promising anti-cancer activity. Now, one of the cancer cell lines that it's very effective at killing is a leukemia cancer cell line, and it also will inhibit the growth of cancer cell lines that have been injected into mice. So if you infect a mouse with a certain cancer cell line, give it a cancer infection, and then give it a dose of this compound, it will increase the life expectancy of the mouse over a mouse that's not been treated with the compound.
Having virtually exhausted the analysis of land species, scientists expect to get 90 to 95% of their new compounds from the sea. But the tapping of this enormous resource has only been going on for the past 10 or 15 years, and it will take just as long again to get this compound from its present stage to where it can be approved for humans. Even then, there's no guarantee in this hit-and-miss type of research. Proposed amendments to the Drug Patent Act could result in more research of this type being done in Canada, but a strong lobby group says the new laws will simply result in higher prices for all drugs.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Rangno, welcome to the show. Mr. Mailloux, glad to have you here.
Nice to be here.
You're proponents of this bill.
Yes.
How is it that this young professor can do this kind of research without benefit of the bill that you feel is so important for research?
Well, at the moment, we just don't have this sort of patent protection. Mr. Mailloux would be able to comment on this a little bit more fully, but it's a strange enigma. We have patents to protect the invention of a new mousetrap, but not to protect a new drug, whatever it be.
But isn't this just one more means of the U.S. putting the screws to Canada to get more money out of the Canadian consumer?
No, I don't, I don't follow that argument at all, Iona, because going back before any of the free trade discussions, talks were going on between governments and the Liberal Party at that time, the party that was in power. And I served on the committee for André Ouellette, so I know that it was the British government, French government, German government, Swiss, as well as the Americans, who were saying, look, you want us to respect your patents, we want you to respect ours.
But brand name products have been licensed by generic drug firms since 1969. They paid a 4% developer's fee in order to get the license. Isn't that enough of an incentive? Why do you have to have more? Are they greedy?
Well, I think the question should be asked. Are they selling at the right price, or should their price be lower? They pay 4%. They pay about $75,000 to get a drug on the market, as compared to $100 million that's invested. Because what we've just seen with going on at UBC is really just the start. It's the tip of the iceberg.
But before the 1969 amendments were brought into the Patent Act, you had to wait something like 17 years before you could get a generic drug on the market. And currently, the new bill says 10 years, but in actual fact, for recent years, it's been about 4 years that you've had to wait, roughly.
I'd like to correct you. If you look at averages, and averages
Yes.
are always something you have to look at,
Right.
you're looking at about 9.9 years, with a few exceptions in recent times where they've had a couple of products that they managed to get out in 4 or 5 years. But this is not the whole thing of the average. The other thing is, in the 17 years, there's about 10 years development time. And what the government has said today is, we'll give you a compromise. We'll give you from 7 to 10 years. And if they want a license and they want to manufacture and market in Canada, they can get it at 7 years. So that's a long way from being 17
But
years.
the Eastman report said that 4 years was suitable. I mean, after all, he was the government investigator. He came up with this recommendation. Why change? Why go to the pressure groups?
Well, I don't think you go to pressure groups. I think, you know, that's part of the political process in any case. You're talking with Dr. Eastman, who looked at a point in time and said, you know, 4 years might be fine. On the other hand, he said increase the royalty to 14%.
Right.
Which would also have increased the price of all products in the market. And I think in this bill, you've got a situation today where it's good for the industry, it's good for scientists, and it's good for consumers too, because consumers are now going to get protected on the prices of all products, not just a very small slice of the market.
I don't know, Professor Rangno, you work in St. Paul's, and you know that the stress right now on the budgets that are put in for all health care is enormous. Now, estimates are that it's going to cost Ontario about $35 million or more a year if this goes through. That means about 10 to 12 million for British Columbia. Are you, as a healthcare professional, willing to give up the amount that budget is going to put pressure on your health care in St. Paul's?
Well, I think some of these are estimates, and maybe sort of some of them may be a little bit overblown. I think I look at it the same way as I do when I give a medication to a patient. There is a risk-benefit ratio, and as long as the benefits remain high, then one accepts some small degree of risk. And in this case, I would sort of say it's cost-benefit. And I think that from what I understand of the bill, there are sufficient checks which will watch costs. And I would hope that to encourage research from all aspects, all the way from the developing, production, jobs, and certainly as a scientist, we've been thwarted in the last number of years. I contrast it with experience back in Montreal prior to the original act. And there was a flourishing relationship between academia and the drug industry. And then it just, poof,
But in spite of that, 19,000 jobs have been made in the industry in Canada in that period of time. In spite of that, we've had a flourishing, profitable drug industry in Canada. Why do they want more profits? I mean, what's it going to do for Canada? What's it going to do for Canadians?
There's no control, though. You know, as we say in science, you need to control, Iona. Certainly, progress has been made in a number of areas. There have been jobs created. I think the only comparison is how many more jobs might have been saved. Certainly, I was in the era when a number of the companies moved out of Canada. People had to move with them.
But they didn't necessarily move out of Canada. Let's face it, some of them only moved from Montreal to Toronto. We were told they were moved out of Canada.
Well, there was,
a lot
both.
of people moved out of Montreal in those days.
That's right, but there was both. There was also a shift to the United States, and I think what Dr. Rangno has said is correct. What has happened is that the job creation that should have taken place, and you know, I'm not going to quarrel with what was done in '69, whether it was right or wrong. The fact is, we might have had more benefit if they'd taken a different means to control prices and also create jobs.
Well, the fact is that Canada had the highest drug prices in the world previous to the 1969 Act, and now we're probably one of the lowest prices in the world.
We're amongst the lowest.
You tell me, what's going to happen to the Canadian generic industry as a result of this bill?
Canadian generic industry is going to flourish just as it's doing in the United States. It's growing at 30% a year in the United States.
Well, that's not what they say.
Of course that's not what they say. I mean, there's a lot of emotional rhetoric that's been thrown out. 650 million here and whatever. I could take figures and show that it's going to save Canadians $2 billion just in the cost savings by having a cost review board that's effective.
Why do they need a cost review board if they say there's going to be no increase of price? Isn't there something wrong with that? If they're going to have, if they say there's no increase coming, and they say that, certainly the Prime Minister said it, Mr. Andre said it, why do they have to have a cost review board if there's going to be no increase in price?
Because what they've said is, with having a cost review board, we will make sure that costs will not escalate, because they've got all the other sides saying, oh boy, this is going to be great. Costs are going to go sky high. And the government has said, here, we'll put a check in and we'll watch it. Don't forget, that's not done today except by 10 different provinces.
The fact is that the generics saved Canadian consumers $211 million in 1983. They estimate they will save up to $500 million a year in the future. Take that to a 10-year perspective, and it's a whole lot more than what's being promised.
But Iona, have you checked the mathematics on it? Have you really looked at it?
Yes.
I mean, even if you look at $200 million, and it's not a small amount of money, but you're looking at $8 per capita approximately per year.
$8 per capita.
And what about new drugs? I mean, who's going to pay for the development of new drugs?
Well, you're saying, in effect, that you believe that multinationals have a national conscience. I don't believe they do. They belong to the world. They are not going to spend any more time in Canada than they do now.
We all belong to the world. We're an international. Canada's part of the world. Canada doesn't sit as an island anymore. It sits as part of the post-industrial world.
But you're in favor of the U.S. multinationals having a monopoly again.
No, I'm in favor of seeing drug research done here, seeing reasonable prices and jobs created. I'm a Canadian. I worked in the transnational or multinational industry, if you like, and I work for a Canadian company today. And I want to see the best of both worlds, and we can have it because the bill's a compromise. It's not a cop-out.
Thank you, Mr. Mailloux. We're going to go to the break now, and we'll come back with Jean Swanson and with Russ Hunter. Jean Swanson represents a group that is saying they want an end to legislated poverty. Jean, tell me what that means.
Well, we think that most poverty is legislated. In BC, there's over 200,000 people on welfare. The welfare rates are 40% of the poverty line. Welfare rates are legislated, therefore poverty is legislated. A lot of people are poor because they don't have jobs. The government could pass budgets which would create jobs. Therefore, a lot of those unemployed are poor because poverty is legislated, also with the minimum wage.
One of the areas that poverty is most prevalent is amongst our senior citizens, and we have here Russ. And Russ Hunter, tell me about the group you represent.
Well, we have 110,000 seniors in this province who I represent with the Costco group, but I'm not using the Costco name today because I'm going to go to the Seniors Caucus, which I am also in. And they are more concerned, I think, than the whole group of the Costco group.
Well, Jack had Harvey Andre on the show just recently, and speaking on this issue, and Andre said that not all senior citizens were opposed to the legislation. Do you find that to be the case amongst your membership?
Yes.
Why?
Well, it is a political move, and if we all thought the same way, well, there wouldn't be any country, actually.
So what's going to happen? Are we going to have the Grey Panthers marching on Parliament Hill, or aren't we?
Well, I told them that 2 weeks ago. If they want to get us all mobilized, let's go at them.
Okay.
If they're looking for a fight.
Jean, the BC Pharmacare has put a ceiling on themselves of $120 million. Now, what's going to be the result to welfare people, senior citizens, the sick, if costs do start to rise exponentially as a result of this bill?
We see two problems. One is people that aren't covered by drug programs. That is, people have to pay the first $200 before Pharmacare kicks in. They just will have to make a choice between food and drugs, a lot of them. There's a lot of working poor people in this province that aren't covered by drug programs. Secondly, the people that are covered by drug programs, the disabled, the seniors, people on social assistance, that whole program is at risk.
But
This government is known for cutting back on
We just had two guests who said that it's not going to rise exponentially. We have the Prime Minister telling us, we have Harvey Andre telling us that they said it will not raise, the prices will not raise in any unfair way, that there will be no real dramatic increase in drug prices. Now, do you believe them?
I don't believe them. I
Why?
think the main thing that proves that they're wrong is that the federal government has already agreed to give provinces $100 million over the next 4 years to cover increased costs of drugs. Now, if drug prices weren't going to go up, why would the federal government do this?
That was my argument on why they have to have a review board. Will senior citizens be the first in line when that review board comes into being, Russ?
I am very concerned about this. I believe that if I recall correctly, there's $25 million for a year, for 4 years, is on a per capita basis. Where is the per capita, the most of it is in Ontario,
Mr.
Quebec.
Mailloux said just $8 per capita.
Sometimes you take that $8 out of an old age pension check and you're taking it out of your stomach.
And that's an average, you know, and if you get sick, you probably are going to have to pay more than $8.
Well, they don't want to have averages on one side of the question, but they don't mind it on the other.
This is a tax on the sick,
sure.
is what it is.
And what's your response to the charge that Canada is scavenging off the intellectual property of the United States in this matter?
Well, I think the responsibility of a government is to pass laws that kind of form a balance between public rights and private rights, and that's what we have now. The 1969 Act forms that balance. The generic companies, they pay a royalty. It takes them 4 or 5 years to get into the market, so that means the brand name companies have time there. And the public is protected, and I think that's the kind of thing, the kind of law that politicians should be passing.
Well, there are dependent people in every province, and the provincial governments are responsible for their protection. And if the prices begin to go up in generic drugs, then these dependent people are obviously going to pay the bill. So far, we're being told that there is going to be no increase. How can you fight that logic? They're saying there's going to be no increase. And then when there is, what will you do? It'll be too late.
They tried to tell us that in the pension indexing too, but they sure backed down a bit.
And what about the development of new drugs? How do you feel, what is fair to assist the pharmaceutical industry in the development of new drugs?
I'd like to see them just leave it alone. The seniors are fairly well off. Just leave it alone. We don't want to cause a big kerfuffle in this country.
Well, the bill is going to pass, you know, let's face it.
I wanted to make 2 points. One is, I think you're saying it's too much a fait accompli. I think what we need to do is get your viewers out there writing to their MP, writing to that parliamentary committee, insisting that they hear witnesses. Come tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, your viewers who want to help us fight this can come down to 509 East Hastings, and we're going to launch our Message in a Bottle campaign.
What's that? Tell us what that is. Come on.
We will send messages to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney telling him, don't change the Patent Act. We'll put the message in an old plastic prescription empty drug bottle and send it off to him. And we've invited the media. We're going to launch this campaign, and we hope it takes off across Canada.
Okay, I've got 4 people for you here, and we're getting ready for your calls right now. I hope you'll call in and ask them the tough questions that you want to ask them on both sides of the pharmaceutical issue. Are the consumers of Canada going to spend more money on their prescription drugs, or aren't they? We'll be back after the break, and I hope you'll be on the phones when we come back.
Okay, I'm going to slide you over to this side now.
Bring back the gentleman.
I haven't changed it over yet, Denny. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, check, check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Strange.
High profile.
Yeah, 160,000 viewers here, so you're getting your message across. We'll do about 10 minutes of this.
You're more in the hot seat. That was fine.
Okay.
Going high enough up for you?
A little bit higher.
A little higher? Okay.
Now we're going to go to your calls on the generic drug issue. You're on the air. What's your question, please?
It's very nice to see you instead of Webster.
Well, I'll tell him you said so. Who would you like?
I hope you play racquetball better than he does.
I don't play it at all, so you're in luck. Who's your question for, sir?
I want to make 2 points. The first point is, what exactly is someone below the poverty line? I'm a statistician, and I am now below the poverty line.
Jean, I think that's your question.
Let me point out something first. The poverty line is anyone who gets less than half the average income, and assets do not enter into it. So we will always have 25% people in the poverty line.
I don't quite understand what you're saying, but I'm going to let Jean give you a response. Go ahead, Jean.
Okay, there's 4 national groups that make poverty lines. They're almost all pretty close to the same. That's one method of doing it. Other groups go around with a shopping basket and saying, you know, how much do you need to live on? What it boils down to is, if you're single, it's about $10,000 a year. If you've got 2 people in the family, it's about 15, 3 people, 18.
And what's your second point, sir?
Well, the first is that is not the correct answer, but
well,
in any event, my second
you get one more chance, so go ahead.
The second point is this. With this business of generic drugs, the situation is this. They will be cheaper. However, new drugs will take about 5 years to get to us, because the firms that spend hundreds of millions of dollars developing these must get their money back. So, you will get them cheaper, but if there's a cure for cancer that comes out, it will not get to Canada for 5 years, because it's the same as the soft polio vaccine.
Okay, sir, that's a question for Dr. Robert Rangno, and you get the response to that one. Thank you, sir.
Well, I think your point's well taken. The research in this area has not flourished since '69. We only see compounds long after they have been introduced to many other areas of the world. So we're seeing them late. We're not getting to do any of the research to develop.
So you think this bill will speed it up? The whole process will be speeded up because of this bill?
I would hope so. Again, I'm saying like a drug, there's a risk-benefit. And as long as you monitor the system, then I think hopefully in the end, the benefit should outweigh.
Okay, we're going to go to another call. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Oh, good afternoon, Iona.
Hello.
I have a question here. I don't know if Mr. Mailloux is a representative for the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada or not, but one of the things that they're hinging on this Bill C20 coming through is this pie-in-the-sky vision of mass research coming into Canada for drug research. Now, prior to '69, before the bill ever coming in, there was no original research done in Canada. There's been no original research done in Canada in the drug industry. I find it a little odd that they would even say that. Most of the drug research, if not all of drug research in the world, Mr. Mailloux being the internationalist that he claims to be, is done in Switzerland, West Germany, and the United States of America. There's none done in...
Well, you're right. Dr. Mailloux, go ahead.
I don't agree, and I think, in fact, if the gentleman who's calling in really knew the figures, he would realize that prior to 1969, there were more basic research institutes in Canada than there were in the UK. If you look at that today, we're far behind the UK.
But if I could just have one more...
okay, go ahead. You get another minute.
I just have one more thing. If people really want to read up on this, there's a magazine called This Magazine, the August issue. John Sawatsky, one of the best investigative reporters in Canada, has done a piece on the PMAC and the lobbying that went on by this group. And just one other question is $7,000 per doctor per year in Canada is the budget that the PMAC pulls off to lobby. You know, that runs into $270 million a year. That's their advertising budget.
Thank you.
But almighty, Mr. Mailloux,
Thank you for your call. I've got the drift of what you have in mind here. I've heard it described, the lobbying in this regard, as being second only to the National Rifle Association in vociferousness. How do you react to that?
I react just with a laugh, and I react the same way when I hear about this magazine, which is an extreme left-wing magazine that was written up in the Globe and Mail just recently.
You calling John Sawatsky an extreme left-winger?
If you look at that article and you look at the magazine, it was written up in the Globe and Mail as being a very left-wing, anti-business magazine. Secondly, I wasn't interviewed, and yet I'm quoted, although not named, throughout that article. But I was never interviewed for the article, so I have my quarrel with a lot of the facts that are in there.
Okay, we're going to go to another call. Go ahead.
I'd like to make a couple points about research, because I think that's the issue that's getting some people who would ordinarily be fighting against high prices worried, because they're thinking, you know, gee, we need new research for cancer, we need research for Alzheimer's and this kind of thing. But there's two problems about changing the Patent Act to get research. One is it's a very inefficient way to spend money. And the second is it's a very regressive way to spend money, because it gets its money from sick people, from low-income people. It's inefficient.
Well, I'd like to let you go on, but I've just got to bring this other one in.
Just let me finish here in one respect. What the government would be doing with this act is allowing multinationals to basically have a monopoly, charge what they want. It isn't writing down any place in blood, you will do this much research.
No, there are no guarantees.
You will create this many jobs.
No, that's
you
the question.
will focus on this drug.
Right.
At the same time as saying we need this for research is cutting back on grants to the National Research Council, cutting back on grants to universities to do this. That's where we could get real good research happening.
Thank you, Gina. I've got to go to the phones. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes. My question is to any one of your guests.
Thank you.
If what they say that after, I think it's 10 years was the arbitrary figure, to pay for the research of that drug, the point that I'm trying to bring across is why is the drugs that have already been in existence for 10 or 15 years or 20 years, they have not come down to the price of the generic drugs. I take medication every month, and to buy that prescription under the norm, it's costing me $18 close to it, and I buy generic at less than $7 for exactly the same product. What I'm saying is, if they are saying, yes, we're going to spend this money on research, but we need that protection for 10 years, I can almost buy that. But why has not, for instance, the drugs that are being on the market now for in excess of 10 years come down, then there would be no problem with the generic drugs, would there?
Thank you for your question. Mr. Mailloux, what guarantees are there that there will be continued research in Canada after this bill is passed?
Well, you see, part of the Drug Review Price Board is also to look at the amount of research being spent by the industry.
And what happens if they don't?
And after 4 years, there's a review by government, and after 10 years, a review by the House.
So we'd have to wait 10 years before Parliament would look at it again.
You've got to wait 4 years, and in 4 years you will have the figures. And there's a lot of clubs built into this.
Thank you for your call, sir. Go ahead.
This government has governments in general have a real double standard. They'll let corporations, multinationals in particular, make all kinds of dough without getting anything in writing. But if you were in welfare and you wanted a little bit of money to take a course, you'd have to sign in blood that you'd finish it and get a job afterwards.
Well,
and
that's
the same
right.
with a lot of
and
other
there are
things.
no guarantees in this bill apart from review at 4 years and review at 10 years. Well, we'll go to the phones again. Here, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, this whole idea of legislated poverty, it kind of gets to me. I don't want to claim to be a strong right-winger, but on an industry such as the pharmaceutical industry, it's obviously in the end result, which is your last caller was talking about, the product coming out, it's going to be a high-profit business. But I just don't see how you can have new research and new drugs coming in for cures for diseases without making a profit.
The fact is that since the 1969 changes, 19 new companies have come into existence in Canada. But I think I will ask Jean to respond to your question here. I'll turn off right now and you can listen on the air.
I don't exactly know what the question was.
Well, he doesn't want to be a right-winger. Well, we'll go to another one. Go ahead.
I'd like to comment briefly, though, on your 19 companies, because I've seen the list, and the list has change of addresses and everything else. There have not been 19 new companies come in here since '69. That I can assure you.
Well, there's a lot of misinformation. For instance, Valium, which costs $360 in the United States and costs about $6 here. I mean, there are a lot of changes that have come on.
But in 1981, when the Valium patent ran out, there was only a 25% difference between the generic and the brand name in Canada.
And companies that have only one product, like Tagamet and so on. Well, we must go along here. I want to get some more calls. Maybe I can get one for you, Russ. Here we are. You're on the air. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I have a very simple question. What is the bottom line? Are we or are we not going to have to pay higher drug prices with this act?
I wish we knew. I don't think that anybody at this point can tell, but I'm going to start with Russ Hunter here, representing the senior citizens. Do you think there's going to be a bigger cost for prescription drugs after this act?
Yes.
How about you, Jean?
It's obvious if there wasn't going to be a bigger cost, why would the government give $100 million to provinces to pay for increased
Professor?
costs?
I think there'll be some increase, but I hope that the benefits would outweigh that increase.
Mr. Mailloux.
The increase will be within the cost of living index, and that has been guaranteed by the government, by the industry. And I think if you look at in the total, and Saskatchewan just did this, they expect that their drug plan cost is going to decrease rather than increase.
Well,
and that's something important to realize.
Well, I think we're going to be looking at this after the fact and checking out all of these various statements. But I have to go to the break now, and I'll be back in just a few minutes. Well, here we are with Professor Fred Knelman, and well, President Reagan's popularity is plummeting. His whole government is in a state of upset. I guess we've never seen quite this equal. Do you think what's happening with the Iran question is similar to Watergate, or is it different? Is it more dangerous to the security of the world, or less?
Well,
How do you see it?
Most people don't think it's as serious as Watergate. I'm one of the people who thinks it's far more serious, because after all, I mean, Watergate was a crime against the Democratic Party, a break-in, a cover-up, and so on. But this has enormous international repercussions that I think are far more deep and far more serious. And also I think that excuse the pun, as the plot sickens day by day, we will find...
You'll be forgiven for that.
I hope so. We will find that the whole government is infected with this particular disease of parallel government, secret government, a government based upon such simplistic worldviews, images of the world.
But Mr. Knelman, you've written this book, Reagan, God, and the Bomb, and you have done a lot of study of President Reagan. Don't people think you're just another communist pinko sympathizer? I mean, after all, isn't that what the
strangely enough, you know, I think they might have before November the 2nd, you know? Now, and some people obviously did, but I saw Jim Wright, who is the House leader now, the new Democratic House leader who took over from Tip O'Neill, who finally said openly, you know, finally showed that the emperor's new clothes.
That he had no clothes.
Exactly. That he was naked and that it wasn't very pleasant to look at. And what he said is that Mr. Reagan has an incapacity to listen to the facts. He simply ignores the facts. They are put aside, and he's done this always. They're put aside and buried in his global image of what the truth is.
But what's wrong? When I was in New York a year ago, I received one of these little red cards, and the little card said that in case of a nuclear war, the bearer of the card, who had to be a born-again Christian, would be raptured up to God minutes before the Armageddon or the Holocaust arrived.
Right.
Is there some kind of a link between the government of the United States and the fundamentalists, the Jerry Falwells and the rest?
Well, I think there's a link. I'm not sure in this case that there's a legal link, because you know in the American Constitution there is clear separation of church and state. But the facts as we now know them is that Mr. Reagan is born again, Mr. Meese is born again, Mr. Weinberger is born again, and they all believe in the rapture. They all believe in it.
You explain the rapture to me.
Well, the rapture is a notion. It's a strange one because it's hard to justify. Like biblical scholars laugh at it. Nevertheless, it's taken seriously by perhaps some 40 million Americans and people all over the world. It's the belief that the true believers, the born-again believers, just prior to the final days, which is the Battle of Armageddon, in a little valley near a mountain called Har Megiddo in Israel.
I've been there, Megiddo, the town of Megiddo. You can stand on a hill there and you can see 5 countries.
Yes, and Napoleon was once there and said it would make a great place for a cavalry battle.
Well, we don't have cavalry battles anymore. So tell me what...
But these people believe that that final Battle of Armageddon will happen. It will happen in our times. It will be a nuclear war, and that only the true believers will be saved. And they'll be saved by being whisked physically away.
Are you telling me that the President of the United States, of the most powerful nation in the world, believes in a theory that the world will end in his time?
Yes.
Well,
I truly believe that. And for example, it's on the record. Here's the way it's on the record. On a radio show in Washington, Mr. Weinberger was asked by the interviewer, do you believe in the end of the world? And he said yes, because it's in the Bible. They said, do you believe it will happen by an act of God or an act of man? He said, I pray every night that we will be strong enough to defeat evil in the final
but
battle.
how can such people, Mr. Knelman, go to Reykjavik and talk about peace when they believe that
but Reykjavik is part of the plot.
Tell
you
me,
see,
what
sure.
kind of plot?
But, look, you see, the Americans are now dedicated, this administration, from the beginning, is dedicated to being meaningfully superior and to suffocate the Soviet Union economically through the arms race. So what happens? Just before Reykjavik, the Senate and the House attach riders to impending legislation, which the president needs, and the riders are, you must abide by SALT II. Mm-hmm. You must sign a comprehensive test ban treaty. You must obey the real meaning of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And suddenly Mr. Reagan, surprising all of them, says, I'm going to Reykjavik to meet with Mr. Gorbachev and settle the world's problems.
Yes.
So what does the House and Senate do? They collapse. Mr. Reagan says, look, if you tie my hands with these riders to the legislation, how will I be able to negotiate the peace?
So you're saying that he can still manage to talk peace even though he believes the world will end?
Mr. Reagan is an honest old duffer. That's why Mr. Reagan is, you know that Mr. Reagan characteristically falls asleep at National Security Council meetings.
Are you telling me that the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, and the most powerful nation in the world, are you saying the man's senile? Is that what you're saying?
Not only is he senile, but some really speech experts, have analyzed his notorious lapses, the reign of error, you know?
Yes.
What Larry Speake says almost every month in the last 6 years.
But
the president has misspoke.
Okay,
you know what I mean?
Misspoke. He said that of Nixon back in the Watergate trials. The president misspoke himself. They meant the president lies.
That's right. No, it's not lying. No, please let me finish this. Mr. Reagan does not lie.
Yes.
Mr. Reagan tells the truth, but he doesn't know the truth.
Look, it reminds me of the old quote by Phil Ghilardi. Phil Ghilardi, the famous highways minister of British Columbia, said, I do not lie. Sometimes when I appear to lie, it's because I think I'm telling the truth. Now, we have to get down to cases with the president here. Right. Now, first of all, tell me, did he know? What did he know? If he knew?
Well, here's what I'm certain of. I'm certain of that he was told about the Iran deal and that it was programmed for November 3rd or 2nd. The hostages were to be released just before the voters went to vote for that midterm election.
And you tell me, if all of those hostages had been released, would anybody have cared what was done?
I think so. Or at least the advisors of Mr. Reagan believed that might have tipped the scales in the Senate races.
Remember when the returned hostage, Jacobson, came in and the press was all crowding around and he said, don't you dare ask questions because you will jeopardize the life of others?
That's right.
And of course, we now know that this was one of the vital questions. How much is the United States press being held in check by these kinds of strictures?
You're dealing with an ecology of deceit. It's just, the web is so complex, it's unbelievable. But I was just going to say to you that I'm convinced that at some point or other, Mr. Poindexter or Ronald Regan or Mr. Meese or somebody, or Casey himself, William Casey.
Had a heart attack this afternoon.
And just in time because he was to have been before the Senate Intelligence Committee tomorrow. At some point or other, they said to Mr. President, we have a scheme to get the hostages out. And we can get them out before November the 4th.
Mr. Knelman, you sound like a pretty cynical man to me.
Oh, I am cynical about that.
Tell me.
More than that, they also said we have, part of that scheme has a side benefit. We can get money from the Iranians for selling them arms which won't change the outcome of the war, and we can get that money to the freedom fighters who Reagan called equivalent to the founding fathers of America, to Mr. George Washington himself.
National heroes.
Yes, we can get some of that money to them, and Reagan said, go ahead. But 2 days later or 1 day later, if you were to ask him if he were told something specific like that, he could honestly say, I don't know anything about it.
Well,
That's
what
quite
you're
in
really
character.
saying is that he knew, but he forgot that he knew.
That's right. Or he didn't understand the full implication and therefore can say quite honestly to the public looking into the camera, you know, he once in a moment of totally uncharacteristic candor said, I am the Errol Flynn of B movies. You know?
Well, we can't run the world on B movies. We're going to go to a break now, and we'll be back with your questions to Fred Knelman right after the break.
You know, sort of basically establish who he is and where he's coming from.
Actually, I've been researching Mr. Reagan now for 6 full years.
Sure.
Ever since I worked 1 year for Jerry Brown.
We're talking to Professor Fred Knelman today. He wrote the book Reagan, God, and the Bomb. He's a retired professor and does certain teaching part-time at UBC and Simon Fraser and also the University of California. The professor is also, I think, one of the few that I know who's ever worked for Jerry Brown, Governor Jerry Brown of California.
One winter as an advisor to the California government.
What made you start researching Ronald Reagan?
It really was the California experience, because one of the things I discovered was that Jerry Brown was on a secret hit list of the Reagan administration and of certain administrators. Do you remember Ann Gorsuch?
Oh, yes, terrible
Who
thing.
was the EPA director.
Yes.
And she was really instructed to embarrass Brown over environmental issues. And there were all kinds of plots because Brown was seen as a potential threat in '84, a more substantial threat than Carter.
God forbid we should have anyone who cares about the environment.
And you know what Reagan said, is pollution is caused by trees.
Yes, of course, and bird poop. But you were telling me that Reagan seems to see things in black and white, evil empire versus the good...
It's quite remarkable that he can ignore the facts totally. He can ignore reason, and this is notorious. There's so many examples of it, because he has this simplistic view of the world as divided between the biblical struggle between good and evil.
Let's see what the people have to say.
Sure.
You're on the air. Go ahead, please, to Fred Knelman.
Yes, I would agree 100% with your speaker. It's been documented many times that Mr. Reagan has had these serious lapses, and due to his age and his beliefs, I think a great majority of the public views him as a very dangerous leader.
Do you have a question, sir?
Not so much a question as more stating support to the speaker, that I think the public is quite worried about Mr. Reagan as a Western leader.
Thank you for your call. You're on the air. Go ahead, please. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Professor Knelman, Mr. Reagan seems to have a real propensity for using the Bible to support a lot of his... Are you there?
Very much so. Yes, he does.
He used to use the scriptures a lot for supporting a lot of his lunatic ideas. And if I can just read you one quote, he was being criticized about his arms buildup, and he said during a conference, well, I don't think I've ever used the Bible to further political ends or not, but I found that the Bible contains an answer to just about everything and every problem that confronts us. And I find this a little dangerous. You know, this guy can label the Contras the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers. He uses the Bible to support every kind of crackpot schemes that comes out. I'm not surprised at all that the Canadian government's not even aware of what goes on here. He's not going to tell anybody. They should just consult the Bible, and they'll have the truth according to Ronnie.
How about a question?
No, that's absolutely so. And really, I suppose that if you were to get a candid review of the opinion of the world leaders,
yes.
Well, actually,
NATO leaders.
My one question is why do you think the press has been so lax? It's been 6 years that they haven't reported any of this. I mean, they just report verbatim what he says, but they do absolutely no analysis. And now,
I was going to say
they've been caught in a lurch. I've been watching the American reports, and they're obviously embarrassed down there. The American press is totally embarrassed by all of this.
This is absolutely remarkable because he is the Teflon-coated president. The press and the media and the major media have been easier on this man than any president in history.
That's right.
And that's quite remarkable because I remember he once made a statement in an impassioned speech. He said, one thing we can say about America, it has never known slavery. You know, that only one isolated Los Angeles radio reported, the press ignored it. But that's an amazing statement for an American.
Thank you for your call, sir. You know, only 10% of the citizens in the United States in the latest poll believe that the president is telling the truth.
But that's a remarkable turnabout.
Yes. Well, we're going to go to another call here. You're on the air.
Yes, I was just wondering if Reagan is found to have some part in this. Will he have to be stepped down as like Nixon did? And if not, why not?
Well, that's interesting because nobody is using that dreaded word, impeachment.
No.
Everybody, I think by reading between the lines when Howard Baker or Dernberger, who's chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, or even Robert Dole, who will be a presidential candidate, if you read between the lines, they're terribly fearful of impeachment, but they won't use it. What they say is that the president will just come forward. If he won't use the passive term when mistakes were made, that's a way, in effect, to say nobody made mistakes.
Well, probably.
But if he doesn't come forward in the next week or so, there is lurking behind the scenes always the possibility.
No. Thank you for your call, sir. Certainly, there is also lurking behind the scenes that when it happened to President Nixon, if he had not left when he left, he would have been impeached.
That's true.
No doubt about it. Well, we'll go to another call. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Iona.
Hello.
I would just like to ask Mr. Knelman if he believes that the president is in this state, as he says, why does he not just push the button and start the nuclear holocaust as he believes it's going to happen in his...
The president is not crazy. He's not mad. He's just a very simple person with a very simplistic view of the world, and a man who is not interested in history, not interested in the facts.
But are you sure?
But he's not the kind of man to press a button.
If it hadn't been for this crisis, he would have gone down in history as one of the most popular presidents in the history of the United States.
That's true. That's true.
Thank you for your call, sir.
That is true.
We'll go to another line now. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was just listening to what the doctor said. It concerns me. So my question is this. What can we do as Canadians to get rid of Ronald Reagan?
Well, you know, I think that the great mistake Canada's made in the last 6 years, that's under 2 different governments, is to allow themselves incrementally, that is little by little, to be ensnared and enmeshed in the secret agenda of the Reagan administration. And we are enmeshed. The secret agenda is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that a nuclear war will happen and that they can win it.
Tell me, do you believe that's what's behind Star Wars, that they can put an umbrella over the Western world and blast the Eastern world?
You know, Star Wars is a fascinating issue because it's the first time in the history of America that the vast majority of American scientists of the highest order, the greatest experts in the relevant fields are opposed to it. That's never happened before.
Thank
but
you.
Mr. Reagan,
just a moment. We've got a long distance. I'm going to go there.
Sure.
So we're going to go to Victoria right now. You're on the air, Victoria. Go ahead.
Yes, it's Salmon Arm calling.
Oh, Salmon Arm. I'm sorry.
How are you, Iona?
Just fine. Go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to mention one thing. You stated that Mr. Reagan is a born again, and Mr. Meese as well. To your guest there, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
That's what he said to me. Yes.
It is my experience and my understanding, meeting born again Christians and so on, that they are of the belief that they should impose their religion on other people, and people who are not of the born again faith are inferior to them.
That is absolutely true.
Pardon me?
That is absolutely so.
Yes, this is my impression. This is, from personal encounters and so on. Now, the other thing I would like to say is, if this is the case, I feel what is going on with Mr. Reagan is a very scary thing. And I don't want to see him carry out what he believes is right in his religion, to go ahead and push the button and start the nuclear holocaust, and therefore ending the world, and only in his belief the born-again Christians will survive.
Thank you
I think
for your
this
call,
is utter
sir.
insanity, and I think Mr. Reagan should go.
That's absolutely true. Mr. Reagan has said that the prohibition of prayer in the schools is equivalent to driving Jesus out of the temple,
But we're getting to the point, aren't we, where the end justifies the means, and that's the terrifying part about it.
That's absolutely true, but anybody who says, I am the truth, I know the truth, it's the only truth, but then is the most powerful person in the world, is a little scary.
Thank you, Professor Knelman. We've very much enjoyed having you on the show today. And
It's a
I'll be
pleasure.
back in just a moment.
Thank you.
This has been Webster for Monday. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow night because we're going to have Teens in Crisis. We're also going to have Mayor Gordon Campbell on talk about his new priorities and when we can drink the water. That, of course, will be at 5 p.m. precisely. Now stay tuned for the News Hour.